Hello, welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading from Albion to Britannia, Book 3, The Last Wizard by Brandy Pearson. And this is the final chapter, chapter 20, and I think there is an epilogue, but it's very short, so I'm going to try and squeeze it on here as well. They have a big work to try and finally heal the scar from where they closed the thin place, which is in the last book. If you haven't listened to that, you should. So let's see what's going to happen and how this is all going to come together. Oh, and who has been breaking into houses in Albury Gardens? Okay. Chapter 20, The Work in Albury Gardens, Britannia and the Fairies. Sebastian and Rose told us that we needed to perform the work at exactly 4 in the afternoon. It was a grey day, and we all hoped that it would not rain because part of the work would take place in the garden. The garden was closed at dusk, so there should be no one around to see what we were up to. But something happened that threatened the whole endeavour. We'd been keeping the magical objects in Rose's cottage as the safest place, and she agreed to bring them to Miss P's house, where we were all going to assemble. Miss P was going to come and watch the work and help keep an eye out for strangers with Father Joe. Father Joe went to Rose's cottage to accompany her to Miss P's. Rose had the objects in an old leather bag which Father Joe carried for her. They were halfway down our road when someone jumped out from behind a hedge and snatched the bag from Father Joe and pushed him hard so that he staggered into Rose. Rose fell over. By the time he helped her to her feet, the stranger had disappeared. They hurried to Miss P's to tell us what had happened. Sebastian ran out of the house and up the road to head off the stranger as he tried to leave the triangle. Most of the rest of us followed him out of the house to try and find the mugger. Ruth, Leah and I ran down the road, but Ruth suddenly yelled, "Stop! This is where Rose fell over. Look, there's a button from her coat. Rose had a black coat with very distinctive red and green gold buttons. The gold was glinting in the street light." We stopped, and Ruth and Leah knelt down. Ruth picked up the button to see if they could sense anything useful. It wasn't something I had any skills in, so I looked around the car he was probably crouching behind. There was a cigarette butt and a feeling of frustration and malice. Ruth and Leah had picked it up more clearly and slowly set off across the road. I stood and thought for a moment, remembering the feeling of holding one of the magical objects in my hand. Could I sense where they were? The fairies always seemed to come when the objects were outdoors. I ran back to Miss P's and jumped over the fence into her back garden. "Fairies!" I called. "Can you help us?" Several fairies appeared, looking up at me inquiringly. I told them what had happened. They did not seem to have to look for them. "Big Witch put them in her bag, and Nasty stole it. He ran away with them. He's hiding out of sight, indoors. Broke a window. Bad man." "Can you show me where he was last outside, where he broke the window?" "Of course," said the fairies all together. "Come along." They quickly flitted off, and I had to run to keep up with them. I arrived at the front garden of what I remembered was Mrs. Campbell's house. She'd moved out after what she saw had happened to the nasty mob, but had not yet sold it. A hall window at the side was broken. I looked at my watch. It was about 3:45, 15 minutes before Britannia had told us that we needed to start the work. There was so little time. I wanted to call Sebastian, but I didn't think I had the time. What would Sebastian do? Ruth and Leah ran up, having followed their own path. A plan arrived in my head. "Go round the back," I called to Ruth and Leah. I found a pencil in my pocket, took it out to focus the spell, and spoke the unlocking spell as strongly as I could. The front door sprang open with a bang. I could hear someone inside. I summoned up every bit of magical strength and shouted in a deep voice that was not my own, "Give me back that bag!" I heard someone scrabbling about in the living room. "Give me back that bag!" I called again. I heard the French windows opening with a crash. I ran into the back room. The floor was littered with rubbish, and there was a sleeping bag thrown into a corner. On the table were an odd collection of objects that I suspected had been stolen from our neighbours, and several pizza boxes, chip papers, and boxes and beer cans. But I scarcely stopped because I needed to get to the garden to help Ruth and Leah. However, when I came to the threshold of the French windows, I stopped. Halfway down the garden was a man who I recognised as Eddie, the last of the nasty mob. In his hands he held Rose's leather bag. He was surrounded by fairies, flapping in his face and pulling at the bag to get it away from him. He was quite strong and determined not to let go. It took me a second to remember that he couldn't see the fairies, so I have no idea what he thought was happening. Ruth and Leah arrived and both sang a sleep spell together at him. He crumpled to the ground and let go of the bag. The fairies cheered and took hold of the bag and gave it to Leah. We just had enough time to get to Albury Gardens and begin the work on time. Leah and Ruth set off. I sent a text to Sebastian and my dad so that he could tell Rose and get us all to the gardens in time. But I did not have time to deal with Eddie. I just prayed he would not wake up. We all assembled just in time in the Chapel of Peace. Leah brought the bag with the magical objects. We trooped down the circular staircase into what was now the crypt. It was strange to be there again. I'd gone down there with Father Joe and the monks when we were sorting things out when they originally moved into the house, and they had made the underground tunnel much more friendly as away from the house where they lived to the chapel where they did all their daily prayers, especially when it was raining, and when they came to pray in the middle of the night when it was cold or wet. It was somehow different coming here with a plan to make a magical work. It had been a magic-free space for 2 years now, and I still sometimes had bad dreams about floating over the roaring void. In the instructions Britannia had given Sebastian, Rose and Father Joe, the work started here where the thin place had been, but had a second part that would have to take place outside in Albury Gardens. She had explained the first part was about healing the scar successfully, which would restore and heal the stream of time. But the second part was about spreading that healing across Britain. We got ourselves in the correct positions. Again, I was in the east with the medal opposite Ruth. This time Rose was in the north and Sebastian in the south. Leah was again the ether, the quintessence, but this time she could stand in the centre. As my watch beeped 4 o'clock, we started. This time we had spent months learning our various parts of the work, and it was a different experience doing the work inside. Even with the history of the crypt, it wasn't an overgrown cemetery, and we felt a lot safer as we carried on the work. As the spell progressed, the medal in my hand began to hum with the magic. At the climax of this part of the spell, there was a flash where I could see the thin place in the bridge, but we had been warned about this, so I didn't panic. After the flash passed, something changed that I found difficult to understand. All that had happened in here was suddenly a story to tell, and not quite so much an event that had happened in the past. Leah was not taken over by Britannia again, but sang the last spell of the work in a clear, beautiful voice. As she finished, there was a strangely deep silence. We had been told to keep silence as we walked back up the spiral stairs and out into Albury Gardens. While we had been in the crypt, Mum and Dad and Father Joe had been lighting white candles in a circle that they had marked out on the grass. We took up our places while Father Joe and the others stood around the edge. It was dark now, and the only light came from the candles. Silently, we stood in the garden, and Leah started singing again. As she sang, the fairies began to appear. At first, they were hovering just outside the line of the candles. I could see the candlelight reflected in their tiny eyes. Then one by one we spoke or sang our parts, and the fairies began to fly around the circle. They flew faster and faster. It was difficult not to look at them, but I needed to concentrate on getting my words and actions right. Although we were now speaking or singing, it was as if the silence had followed us from the crypt and was surrounding us. We were singing and speaking into the silence. The fairies flew faster and faster, and there were more and more of them. I could hear what seemed to be the fluttering of thousands of little wings. Perhaps this was what a plague of locusts sounded like. It was a strange and alien sound. I was profoundly glad that I was not doing this alone. Dad was opposite me outside the circle of candles. As the number of fairies grew and grew, I found it more and more difficult to see him clearly. It was as if there was a green mist in front of him. As the work continued, the number of fairies increased and the green mist grew thicker. As it came towards its climax, the fairies started to fly higher and higher. They spiraled around and up, so it seemed as if we were in a growing cone of green. Then Leah started to sing her final section, and something extraordinary happened. The fairies came together over our heads and coalesced into one recognisable figure. the figure of Britannia. For a second she was gigantic, reaching up into the sky. As Leia came to the end of her singing, the giant Britannia lifted her arms as if she were praying, and a green mist spread out from her fingertips. As it spread across the sky, I realised that she was spreading out fairies across the land. Leia had finished her song, but the song went on, and I realised that Britannia was singing in a great gigantic voice that seemed to fill every corner of existence. She came to a crescendo, flinging fairies across the sky, and then gradually her voice grew quieter and quieter. As it did so, she began to lessen, to shrink until she was the size of a young woman, not a lot taller than Leia. The fairies had come and gone, and Britannia stood facing Leia, still singing. Which was when Eddie appeared. Whether he knew about Albury Gardens or not, he must have seen the people and the circle of candles and climbed over the gate. He started to shout above Britannia's singing, swearing and cursing us all. He was shouting about Vlad and Hecate and how he had destroyed their lives so that they scarcely recognised him, that we had stolen Temple House and broken up the Black Moon. Then he made a crucial mistake. He ran into the circle of candles, clearly intending to attack someone. Maybe he wasn't very awake. He glanced around and chose to attack Britannia, perhaps because she was the one who was singing. He rushed at her as if he were going to rugby tackle her to the ground, but when he smacked into her, she didn't move. She didn't step back an inch. He was completely winded and fell backwards onto the grass. Britannia looked down at him and stopped singing. There was complete silence. "Naughty nasty," she said. "You should not have done that." There was no time for Father Joe or anyone else to plead for him. She reached down and patted him on the head, and he turned instantly into a cat, a big, stripy tabby cat lying on his back with his paws in the air. He looked surprised, as if for a second the human Eddie realised what had happened to him. And then the cat rolled over, stood up and stretched. Then Eddie the cat sat down and started to wash himself all over. I think we were all shocked. It had happened so fast it was difficult to take in. What I wanted to do was laugh, but I'd been practising this work long enough to recognise that we had not quite finished, and that I needed to keep going. Britannia started to sing again, and then she paused. "Master Wizard, Mistress Witch, and Father Abbot, it is time." This was not anything we had practised. I did not know what was going on. Father Joe entered the circle of candles, and Sebastian and Rose moved out of their places and came to stand next to him. They seemed entirely unsurprised. This was something they were expecting, but had not told anyone else about. Britannia grew a little, so that she was even taller than Sebastian. "It is time for me to give you my gift. If I do not give you my gift, then the scar will never be properly healed, and the time stream will not be completely restored. Are you ready?" Dad broke the silence. "What's going on?" he asked. Britannia looked at him. I was surprised that he didn't shrivel under her glance. "The Wizard is your friend, but I need to give him the gift. Give all three of them the gift." Dad wasn't going to be put off. "What gift is that?" he asked again. "The gift of death," said Britannia levelly. "No," I found myself levelling. "You can't kill him." I took a step forward, but suddenly couldn't move. I was suddenly afraid that she would turn me into another cat, but she allowed me to return to my place. I was appalled, but could do nothing. They had been alive for more than 350 years. Suddenly it became clear to me. They were a part of the disruptions to the time stream. If we were healing the scars, then their immortality was an anomaly that needed sorting. But they were all my friends, and Sebastian was my master, teaching me to be a wizard. There was nothing I could do as Britannia reached out and touched each one of them on the head. They crumpled to the grass and lay there perfectly still. I heard someone call out in horror. Then everything went dark. All the candles had been extinguished at once. There was silence. I felt that Britannia had gone. I realised I was crying. I summoned up my inner wizard and made a ball of light as bright as I could. I was right. She had disappeared. I ran over to Sebastian, Rose, Father Joe, and knelt down. Dad had brought a big torch with him and put it on and came over too. Sebastian lay on the grass looking pale and somehow different. Then he took a deep intake of breath, swore, and opened his eyes. "We thought you died!" I shouted. Rose moaned and sat up. Father Joe opened his eyes and said, "Goodness me." Sebastian climbed to his feet. "Sorry about that. We were not sure what would happen. We knew we needed sorting out. I was wondering if we would age and crumble to dust and blow away." "That would have been gross," I said, still upset. Leah and Ruth came and helped Rose to her feet and hugged her fiercely. Dad gave Father Joe a hand. "Let's go back to the chapel," he said. In the chapel I could see that Sebastian now had a stripe of white hair. He insisted someone find a mirror. There was one in Mum's bag, and he sat closely examining his hair. Rose had always looked older than Sebastian, and her hair seemed to have grown completely white. Father Joe had never had much hair and kept it very short, so he didn't look very much different. "Are you all okay?" Mum asked. "This must be an awful shock." Britannia made it clear to us. Britannia has made it clear to us what the price of this work would be," said Rose. "We didn't quite know what would happen. At first we were all worried about how she would give her gift. But the more we thought about it, the more we knew it would be worth it, to restore magic in the stream of time. And we have not only been alive for a long time, through many periods of history. Life loses its brightness when you know it goes on and on. Now, well, we will not want to waste a moment, because it's suddenly become precious." "There is suddenly so much I've not tried," said Sebastian. "I need to get on with it. I'm glad I've had an apprentice. I have a lot to teach you while I can still remember it." He slapped me on the back and grinned. "What shall we do with Eddie?" Ruth asked. Eddie the cat was rubbing around her legs. "Could we take him in?" Leah asked. "We've always fancied having a cat, but we were in an upstairs flat before, and he seems to like me now he's a cat." "Let's go to that new pizza place up by the station," said Sebastian. "I'm really hungry." "We'll take Eddie home," said Ada, "and meet you there." She and Leah set off for their house, followed by Eddie the cat. Ada and Leah did subsequently try and give him another name, but he only ever answered to Eddie. Perhaps it was his last memory of being human. Okay, that is the end of chapter 20. But now, there is a little epilogue. Wizard Michael Featherstone. It was the following spring, at about the time when Sebastian had been kidnapped the year before. It was Saturday, and my apprenticeship was taking the form of cleaning the floor in the hallway of Temple House. There was a ring on the doorbell. As the nearest, I answered the door. Standing there was a middle-aged man in a plum-coloured corduroy suit. "Good afternoon," he said. "My name is Michael Featherstone. I understand that there is a Sebastian Jones here. Is it possible to see him?" "Come in," I said. "He's in the library. Follow me." The dining room at the back of the house, with a view of the garden, had been converted into a second room for the library. Sebastian was sitting at the table mending books. I introduced Mr. Featherstone, and Sebastian stood up to shake his hand. "I have been recommended by Susan Peregrine, the manager of Hyperborea, to come and see you. She told me that you are a true wizard." "I am indeed," said Sebastian, and he stopped making a secret of it altogether. "How splendid!" said Michael Featherstone. "So am I." He waved his finger in a circle, and a small butterfly flew across the room and out the window. Sebastian laughed and waved the scissors he was holding at a sheet of paper on the desk. It folded itself into a butterfly and followed the real butterfly out of the window. Michael Featherstone laughed. "Come on, apprentice, a little magic from you too." I thought for a second, looking around the room. I pointed at one of the books lying on the table. It opened itself in the middle. The pages started flapping, and it rose from the table and flew around the room. It circled the heads of the two wizards and landed back on the table again. "Well done, lad," said Michael Featherstone. "I've been wondering if I shouldn't take on an apprentice myself." "Who was your master?" I asked him. He was the first true wizard I had met besides Sebastian, and was intrigued to find out his history. Now that the time stream was sorted, he probably had a history. "My master was an elderly wizard called Robert Carson, and he was trained by William Forrest, who was trained by Isidore Tuckwell, who was trained by Frederick Templewick." One of the reasons I've come to see you is to visit this house. Rupert Tuckwell was a descendant of 2 of my ancestors in wizardry." "How wonderful," said Sebastian. "Why don't you sit down and have a cup of tea?" "I'd be delighted. Miles, go and put the kettle on." And so life has gone on. We still have the magic objects, and from time to time the 5 of us go out together and use them. We've added to the book of Isidore and Ada Tuckwell gave me, or left for me in their vault, and tried to do our bit to make Britain a more peaceful and wholesome place. That Easter, Sebastian, Rose and Father Joe went on a weekend break to the Isle of Wight. It was their first crossing of the water from the mainland. They had a very enjoyable time. In the summer, Sebastian took me and my family on an extended field trip to Prague in the Czech Republic. We visited a whole street of medieval buildings that had once held the wisest wizards in Europe. Ruth and her mum took Rose to Ireland to visit holy and magical sites. I had remembered to send Meredith Tuckwell the photograph I had taken of the Tuckwell family vault. Although he wasn't well enough to come over and see it, he contacted the local authority in charge of Daubney Park and paid to have that corner of the cemetery restored. Wizard Michael Featherstone went to visit it on one of his visits to London. He was not the last true wizard to visit Temple House, and some of them were women. And there you go. Oh, I feel a bit emotional. That is the end of From Albion to Britannia, because I guess Britannia is now restored. Thank you very much if you have listened to all of this. I hope you've really enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed reading them. I don't know if I'm going to do any more at any point or read anything else, but if you would like me to, please let it be known, or I may never bother. But yeah, thank you. And thank you to Brandy Pearson, my wonderful mother, for writing all these stories. And yeah, take care.